Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Shephard.
Good morning, everybody. Well done for getting out of bed after last night's festivities. Let me first of all bring in our panel. And the first person is Mirek Dušek, the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. Please welcome Mirek. Please take a seat here. Koray Köse, Chief Industry Officer at Everstream Analytics. Petr Pudil, who's the co-founder of BPD Partners and chairman of the board of GLOBSEC US Foundation. Please welcome Petr. And Abigaël Vasselier, Director for Policy and European Affairs, Mercator Institute for China Studies. Please welcome Abigaël. Everyone, please take a seat. And I'm Robin Shephard. I'm a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., although currently I'm based in Utah, not because I converted to Mormonism, but because I'm doing some work with a very cutting-edge tech company, which if you don't know, you will know, and you should check out. It's called Strider Technologies, and they are arguably the world's leading cybersecurity company and private intelligence company using open source information, looking very specifically at China, but also other malign state actors, including Russia and Iran. And one of the things, and we were just discussing this in the green room, it's one thing for think tank people, policymakers, academics, interested observers to talk about the relationship with China, but when it comes down to hard business, and I think Petr will be one of the people who will be able to talk to this most specifically from his own experience, it's, you know, the calculations, literally the calculations are different because it can affect your bottom line. I think the title, which is Brussels to Beijing, Competing Visions for the Future, I think we could add, we all hope so, because if Brussels doesn't have a competing vision with China for the future, then we're all in trouble. But there is a very specific matter when it comes to international trade, which also filters down, because industry in particular is a target. And China, I think it was in June, there was the China's National Tech Security Conference at which Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, spoke. And of course, he didn't openly say, we're going to go and steal your technology, but was very clear that China wants to win the battle for technology in the world in the 21st century. It completely understands what's at stake. And in a way, one of the things, I'm doing a book on democracy and the digital revolution, one of the concerns I have is that authoritarian states, in some ways, have understood, for all the wrong reasons, the implications and the power of the digital revolution better than democratic states. And I still think we've got some catching up to do. But that's my opinion. I'm moderating the session, not delivering all the insights. What I'd like to do, perhaps first of all, is ask Mirek Dušek, the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, if you could set the stage for us. I mean, there's always the same question arises when it comes to Brussels, the European Union, and relations with the outside world. It's very critical when it comes to China, is how you unified a policy on trade and foreign policy can Brussels make when there are very important individual member states, Germany obviously, which may have interests which somewhat diverge from the broader European Union agenda. How do you see that?
Well, thanks for having me. Just to say, I work for the World Economic Forum, which is an international organization based in Geneva, Switzerland. We're known for organizing the annual meeting in Davos, but we do other things throughout the year. But the main thing we do, we work a lot with companies from around the world. So we have about 900 partner companies from the US, Europe, China, really from around the world. I also do work with governments, but I think the key, let's say, value of our insight would be really from the interaction that we have with companies from around the world. And you mentioned it. I think there is this practical view that's coming
Somebody obviously liked what you were saying so much that they wanted
I should
some...
wait for
Ladies
the...
and gentlemen, please welcome the
background
moderator
music.
of today's first session, Steve Clements.
So I think we have a...
We'll tell Steve to shut up and you carry on. I love Steve, by the way, but...
So, no, first of all, among some of the things I do, we are preparing right now already the annual meeting in Davos, and what is clear is that we live in a more competitive economy globally. So people, even in the title of the session today, we have competition. So you are seeing state actors looking at how they can go for economic competition, supremacy. You could argue that before we had less interference from national security considerations and considerations of economic sovereignty on pure economic decision-making. That is no longer the case. So we see that, obviously, it's changing the global economy. What is concerning, as you all know, is that we live in a very low-growth environment. So if you look at what Kristalina Georgieva is saying at the IMF, she's warning of the tepid 20s. So she's warning that we are, if you look at global trend growth over the past 30 years, we're at 4%. Now we are trending at 3% over the past couple of years. This year, next year is not going to be much better. And so this low growth environment, obviously, it is also a response to some of the shocks that we've had recently. But it is very difficult if you have a low growth environment and at the same time you have a very complicated geopolitical and geoeconomic picture. So it's obviously a drag on growth. Now, in this environment, you could say, okay, then we live in the age of fragmentation. What do we do? But then if you were to kind of exaggerate a little bit, you could use Dickens and say, we live in the worst of times. So it's all this fragmentation taking place. But then when you look particularly at the technological space, and we work a lot on frontier technologies, you could say we live in the best of times, because you are seeing not only AI, but you're seeing a whole set of technologies that are exponentially going to market, that are maturing. And what is also interesting is that they have a feedback loop. So if you look at the intersection of quantum of AI, if you look at what AI is doing to biotechnology, the jump from CRISPR to synthetic biology. So in this context, the EU-China relationship that we are discussing here today, it's about that. So you are seeing, obviously, the role of national security considerations, economic sovereignty, or whatever you call it, considerations. But then on the other hand, you need to innovate, and the European innovation agenda needs to be ambitious, and people are trying to figure it out. And we all know that for innovation to really thrive, you need at least interoperability, you need the exchange of ideas, etc. So maybe just to open it with, I find the EU-China relationship being at that intersection of how do you marry the reality of geopolitical, geoeconomic fragmentation, and we see actors in the international system being more competitive in that regard. But on the other hand, how do you make sure that you have the growth, you have the productivity, and you have the innovation that you need to grow? Because really, we need to avoid the tepid 20s that Kristalina Georgieva is warning about.
Yeah, and there's been quite a lot of writing recently about the danger of the EU becoming essentially technophobic and making it very difficult for startups to get going in comparison with the United States, for example. While obviously there are dangers inherent to AI and the digital revolution, there are also enormous opportunities. But maybe Koray, you can speak to what Mirek said. Also, perhaps introduce some of the work that you're doing at Everstream Analytics. What sort of relationship, from a tech point of view, can the European Union afford to have, and at the same time afford not to have? You know, how do we find that sort of sweet spot between, yes, as Mirek said, having the proper kind of relationship so we don't stifle innovation and investment, but also kind of not getting ourselves into danger? And this is what Strata Technologies does, is in these vast supply chains around the world where you can actually, you can very easily end up not knowing who you're doing business with.
Right. So So I'll take you on a little bit of a journey, but hopefully not on one that's infinitely going on and not answering a narrow question pretty precisely. So just to give you a little bit perspective, I'm economist by trade, I'm a realist by passion, and I'm a technologist, AI technologist and futurist in supply chain risk management by profession. So when I look at that, I want to span it first a little bit wider and then come really narrow down to what that means, that question that you just asked. So in the context of values, what do we usually want to do in supply chain risk management in AI is take complexity and sophistication of the current global value chains into visibility, then into actions that are not only timely, but they're also packed with foresight and intelligence. And in that context, just doing that from the human intelligence perspective is impossible because we're talking thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of partners, suppliers, trade deals, materials, components that go into something like an iPhone, for instance. So Everstream AI works with the world's leading corporations in creating visibility where it's needed. And then, as in business, we always say, you have to combine urgency and criticality because you don't have time to fix everything, but you should fix the most important. And in that context, we also need to think about EU and Beijing or China in that, because what values do we even compete in and share, and what values do we want to actually align with them? Do we share the value of democracy with China? No. Do we share the value of human life with China? No. Do we value that we do not want modern slavery in our supply chains? No. So why do we focus on that? What do we actually value with China? It's actual trade and economy and energy. And in that context, we need to think about our dependencies. And if we don't know that rare earth mineral come from China globally, then we're ignoring the fact that, oh, we're going to fix our tier one supplier and we're going to build this mega factory in Germany, and Germany is going to invest billions of euros and this place is going to soar. Well, guess what? If you don't have the rare earth mineral, we're all going to look at the wall and think about what to do next, let's paint. And that is quite ignorance, quite honestly, in supply chains, because visibility is abysmal down tier 2. So if you ask even aerospace and defense where you get your third tier or fourth tier part from, oh, it's all defined and we can find out. No, you cannot find out, because when you go into China, it turns dark really quickly. So and now to bring that narrow question here. So once we have focused on what we want to compete with China on, then we can determine our actions. What I want to compete with China on is the ability to create an economy that runs in a diversified environment, in a multipolar environment globally, that has the ability to withstand a single choke point or a weaponized business approach by politics, so that tariffs can become truly irrelevant to your economic GDP creation process because you have so many other alternatives to run an economy. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, something we should all focus on and not try to fix the political democratic environment of China in the next decade. Because quite honestly, and maybe that's a little bit provocative, this is China's last decade to be a powerhouse with labor. Their demographic change is imminent, it is obvious, and we should realize that, and hence should prepare ourselves now for tomorrow.
Petr, you were saying a little earlier when we were talking before the session that your company doesn't directly do business in China, but for reasons that Koray has described, the supply chains are enormous and it's very difficult to work out, who actually is at the end of the supply chain. There's also the question of the theft of IP. And as an indication of both the scale but also the ambiguity about it, you will often hear in the United States a figure that China is stealing IP each year in the range of $250 to $600 billion. Well, the margin of error there is greater than the lower figure. So, we know there's a big problem, but we don't know how big it is. I'm always struck, I've spoken a few times to Senator Jim Risch, who's now the ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, and previously he's been the chair of that committee when the Republicans had the control of the Senate. He's a senator from Idaho, and he loves/hates to tell the story of Micron Technologies, which some of you may or may know. And this was this incredible case in about 2017, 2018, where Chinese spies essentially infiltrated this company called Micron Technologies in Idaho, stole the technology, took it back to China, patented it in China, and then sued Micron in the Chinese courts for copyright theft. I mean, one of the most extraordinary, and that's of course got the American Senate going absolutely crazy. Petr, I mean, there is of course the other question. Do you actually take measures in your company to stop, because you're doing some very cutting edge stuff off your own bat. Are you concerned about Chinese people coming in and stealing your technology and taking it back to China?
Yeah, well, just to give you a sense what we do, as the biggest investment in is a company which is called Drova, which is the global leader in the field of special chemicals for mining companies, and we developed revolutionary technologies which we are shaping the industry to be more sustainable. We have a big success globally to implement that technologies with mining companies like Barrick, BHP, and many others. But back to your question, obviously, yeah, through our technology, the western part of the world could get sustainable precious metals like nickel, cobalt, copper, which could change the geopolitical game. So obviously, we are very much concerned. We have a very strict IT security policy. We have a very strict HR policy. But nevertheless, you know, the best way how you can protect your IP is to scale up it quickly. That's the only way on how you can really protect your IP on the real market. And obviously, US is much better fitted, and many other like Western countries. Europe is not so much well fitted for scale up, and that's the big disadvantage for Europe at the moment to keep the pace with China regarding the technology development, not the innovation itself. I think that Europeans are great innovators. Yeah, the technological miracle which we see now in China is driven not only by like stories which you described. Most of these technologies we bring to China voluntarily. Yeah, so especially Europeans, but not only Europeans. Yeah, so I think that IP is a big issue, but I think the much bigger issue is what you said. How we position China as a partner. Do we really consider China as an equal member of WTO, which is sharing the value which they signed off many years ago? That's a critical question, in my view. Because, you know, IP, it's a big topic, in my view, but I wouldn't say that makes our competitive position like a weaker. I think that we are still much more innovative society than Chinese, despite of the all rise in China. But we need to adjust our trading policies.
Thanks, Petr. And maybe, Abigaël, this is the perfect time for you to come into the discussion. As you said, you're French, but you live in Germany, but you spent 5 or 6 years in Brussels. So from the perspective, since the title of the discussion is Brussels to Beijing, first of all, what sort of change have you seen in the last few years, since COVID essentially, but you could argue with the Trump administration was a really big change in Western policy. What sort of change have you seen in the time, in that 4 or 5 year period in Brussels in relation to China? And also, let's speak to the question which always arises when we talk about the European Union and international relations is how united behind the European Union's sort of top level policy are the major member states, or even some of the smaller ones. How do you see that?
Thanks. I mean, brilliant questions. And it brings me back to the idea that Europe has changed extremely fast on China, and the mindset has shifted in all the member states throughout. You were right to point out that COVID, because from one day to another, not only policymakers realized how much dependent we were, but also citizens. And I think the capacity of starting to have a public debate in Europe on China emerged during COVID and over the question of the face mask. You have a second moment, which is the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine was this deep realization that we have reached the point in time where countries are going to weaponize our dependencies. And guess what? The country with which we are the most dependent is actually China. And China is not going to disappear. China is, for Europe, its second biggest partner, and we exchange 2.3 billion per day with China. So there is no way out of Europe-China relations. There is just a big path into how do we manage this this relationship that is changing very fast. And I think the issue is, yes, the Europeans have become extremely realistic about China and have completely changed their policy, but it's first and foremost coming from changes in China. I think this drive towards a techno-authoritarian country that is actually the second trading partner. This led to many questions in Europe of how do we do? And when we looked at the third plenum recently, which is like this big moment where all the leadership in China gather and give what is going to be the economic trajectory of China for the next years. Guess what? Technology was at the forefront of it. And for the Chinese leadership, the technology drive is going to save China's economic growth. So you are in the head of Xi Jinping and you do not think that consumption in China is the solution. You actually think that technology is. And with that comes billions of ideas. First is that then technology transfers is going to matter. Then keeping European companies in China, this needs to become the thing. So China needs to somehow give something to these European companies that want to leave China. Talent acquisition, this is a big question we are facing. And in the meeting room over there, you were saying, yes, how do we maintain people-to-people contact? In reality, we are going to maintain it because we do need also to understand better China, but this is the price to pay. Talent acquisition, this is a big thing. So China is on a trajectory that is changing very fast. Of course, there is a US element to it, and we have moved from being very reactive in our European China policy to actually being a bit looking forward. And I'd like to just put two emphases on where the Europeans are on China to both respond to your question on member states and respond to the question of FTAs. The biggest move from a European perspective have been to build a defensive toolbox to deal with China on security, which is what Mirek was saying, on the level playing field question and on the question of values in an unprecedented way. We have had more investigation on subsidies in the past 6 months than in a year time, which is huge by European standards. We are moving away from this WTO orthodoxy that you always hear in Brussels. They're ready to make some room for discussions. This is gigantic for Europe. So the defensive toolbox is there. It's being used. It's being used with partners, with the US, with Canada, and with others. And this is probably the biggest effort from the EU side. The offensive aspect, which is, okay, once you have built fences, then how do you provide alternative to your companies, which is related to the FTA. Yes, there is diversification, but guess what? With the European Parliament we just got, I think diversification is going to be very difficult. Free trade agreements do not go very well with the rise of the extreme right and populist parties in Europe. So is this the end of FTAs? I do hope not. But when you hear that China is in negotiations with an FTA with Mercosur and that Europe is absolutely blocked on its FTA with Mercosur, I think this is giving you a sense that FTA is not going to probably go very smoothly for Europe. Then there is the other point on the offensive side, which is industrial policy. And this is where the question of the 27 member states come. In terms of agreeing where we are in engaging and cooperating with China, we agree at 27. When it comes to agreeing on an industrial policy, we have 27 ways to do that, and that's very difficult.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everybody, there's a thing called Slido, which you're probably aware of. So you can, if you really want to, send a message onto Slido, or since it's a nice, compact, friendly room, just put your hand up and we can have people jumping in at any time. Just before we go to audience, and as I say, feel absolutely free just to raise your hand and we can pass the mic around. Mirek, perhaps you're best placed to talk about the United States. Obviously, we have an election coming up. I tried to speak to both the Trump camp and the Harris camp, like about 2 weeks ago. I did a piece for Politico, and they were very reluctant to talk. I mean, for equal and opposite reasons. The Harris camp, because essentially their policy is going to be more of the same, but they don't want to say that because that plays into the Trump narrative that Harris is simply Biden Mark II. So they just want to leave that alone. And then on the Trump side, even people like Robert O'Brien, his former national security advisor, who was very polite and very nice, but doesn't want to talk about it because it's the old problem that anytime anyone else in the Trump camp talks about China or anything else, suddenly he goes on X or Truth Central and just kind of squashes what they've just said. But it does look, and everybody I spoke to, and I spoke to a lot of people in Asia as well, that there's going to be, there is, you know, the course is laid in. There is going, the rhetoric and emphasis and tone may change from the United States, but there is probably the strongest consensus on any major policy issue is that China is a threat and it has to be pushed back. Insofar as you would agree with that, Mirek, does it actually make it easier to deal with the United States from a European perspective and thereby prevent a very powerful united front in pushing China back?
No, thanks. If you allow, because I think the US-China relationship and the way they're dealing with it right now, we just saw Sullivan there very recently, I think it was 2 days ago. So we happen to actually, we have the annual meeting in Davos, and then we have actually quite a big meeting for the past 15 years in China. And there have been US officials going to that. So of course you see the changes that are taking place when they do come. But I think one thing which is quite interesting, I think Abigaël, you alluded to it, we are in a transition, even within that relationship that obviously you're right, I think there is a consensus in the US on China. But you can see clearly that they're trying to figure out kind of what are the swim lanes, because it is a hugely important trading and investment relationship for the global economy, even though it's, I think 2022 was about 800 billion, now it's gone down a little bit. But despite the tariffs, it's a huge economic relationship. And so I think they realize that they don't want to lose all of that. The famous small yard high fence of Sullivan is known, and they're trying to kind of figure out where that fence actually is, so that they can then say to their companies, okay, but in these swim lanes, it's actually okay to conduct relations and make money. And so, but then, for example, in pharma and biosciences, so some people would qualify certain parts of that as of national security, and so, but there are big parts of that that are not. And so right now, I think a lot of the actors within the US as well, a lot of corporate actors within the US are trying to figure out what are the swim lanes. That's why you're seeing Raimondo, Sullivan, Yellen, etc., trying to figure that out. And of course, from the Chinese side, I guess there are visits too. So I think that's just that we are in that transition, and I think Europe has that too with China. You're seeing it on EVs, etc. We're trying to figure out where the swim lanes are in that ecosystem. Maybe just if I could say one more thing on what Abigaël was saying, there is an interesting thing on the Chinese economy with these, I think they call it new productive forces or something. And so obviously this whole thing about, it's kind of building on the Made in China 2025, but as you said, it's like a really clear direction of trying to unleash these or master these technologies, frontier technologies, to unleash new productivity in the economy. But I do think that, let's say, the old or the more traditional reform opening up, so that, let's say, the more orthodox economic lexicon is there too. So you of course still see measures around trying to, of course, work with domestic demand, trying to work with the financial sector, etc. I'm not saying it's, but I think it's now we're seeing in the economy both trends, and obviously the emphasis is right now on the new productive forces. But what I also wanted to say is that we do have, of course, now much bigger role for the government in the economy everywhere. So we are seeing that with the IRA. I'm not saying it's the same, but we're seeing it now in Europe. And so, for example, I don't know if you saw in the spring, so IMF is getting very nervous because the old orthodoxy of industrial policy being something that they don't really recommend, suddenly all kinds of actors are doing it. And so obviously some people within these institutions are still saying, oh, be very careful, this did not work in the past, so be very careful how you do it. And obviously they're going for it in different ways. But just to say that we are seeing this quest to try to master these technologies or use them for to compete in the global economy from various actors there. On the EU-US relationship, I think there, we will. I think there is, as you know, still they are working out the kind of the digital technological relationship as well. I think that will be very important as we know which administration is in. If they can succeed in that, I don't know, I think it's a committee or council. I think that would, of course, go a long way.
Yeah, sure. Does anybody from the audience want to jump in? You're very welcome to, the gentleman there.
Can I bring up two uncomfortable facts?
So do you mind just saying who you are?
Arsen Vasselier, former Minister of Finance in Bulgaria, currently a Member of Parliament.
Thank you.
Two uncomfortable facts. One is that the cost of energy in Europe is between 2 and 5 times higher than the cost of energy in China, and how that is going to impact the industrial relations between the two countries and investment and trade. Same is true for the US, but we are focused on China right now. And the other one is Germany lost one of its big competitive advantages, which was cheap Russian gas. How do they feel about losing access to the Chinese market, and how that affect the EU-China relationship long term?
I don't know whether, Abigaël, that's something you can speak to.
I love speaking about Germany. Thanks. Is Germany concerned about losing access to the Chinese market? In the Chinese leadership mindset, right? You have two capitals that count. Unfortunately, they have not completely understood how Europe functions, but this is Germany and France. So if there are two capitals that are not going to lose access to the Chinese market, it's going to be Germany and France. And if you look at how companies are doing in China, the German companies, we have seen them over the past years receiving gifts from the Chinese government, like in an unprecedented fashion, right? The deal with BASF, no one would have predicted it. And this was a gesture towards Germany. You have the opposite conversation, right? Which is when the European Union launched the investigation on electric vehicles, suddenly German companies saying, this is yet another step of Europe politicizing our relationship with China. Can this stop, please? And since then, you see on a regular basis German CEOs coming up prominently with love letters to the Chinese government. And in a way, the Chinese government respond extremely well to that. I mean, the gift package is just huge. I have one question to this, which is why US companies are able to swallow tariffs at a much higher level than European companies. This is a question mark. I think the response is called IRA. And maybe it's time for us to think about how do we work better with our companies when it comes to de-risking. Because I think that's an additional dimension of what we are discussing here. There will not be any conversations on securing supply chains, on de-risking, on protecting ourselves from China when it comes, for instance, to coercive measures and weaponizing trade without our companies. We are not going to do that without them, and without our citizens, because the price to pay, and this is related to your energy question, the price to pay to de-risking is going to be called inflation, and this is going to cost us money. And the security premium that citizens will be willing to pay, this is not there because we have not explained to them that this is going to cost them money. And for me, companies and citizens are the missing pieces in Europe. So yes, at 27, I think we agree when it comes to the trajectory. And in Brussels, I've lived with Hungary and Sweden or the Netherlands and all at once, and we can live in this beautiful world. And Hungary swallowed the moment we call China a systemic rival, and in the same way, the Netherlands swallowed the fact that on export control, we would be criticizing their decisions. So we can live with 27 divergent views, but what we cannot live with is companies having a completely disconnected mindset when it comes to China. And as we see it in Germany, Germany is just an illustration, but you have others behind, an illustration of what does it mean in a way.
Thank you. Petr, did you want to say, add anything to that?
Yeah, well, maybe I will add some view from like a business point. First of all, the good news is that actually capital market is not blind. And if you raise money now, and doesn't matter if it's capital market, even if you go to the bank, that your dependency on China and your supply chain would be always under the very tough due diligence process coming from the investors. So, and believe me that all companies all around the world, in US, in EU, are considering the dependency on China in their directly or indirectly. So things are moving. You see the huge drop of in foreign investments in China, which is actually driven mostly by market, not so much by policymakers, which is fine. The bad news is obviously for Europe, because this panel is focused more on EU-China, that actually many European companies are very much dependent on China. And especially from not only from the supply chain point of view, but from the sales point of view and the margin point of view. Yeah, the margin which many European companies are creating at the moment in China is much bigger than in Europe. It's I call it as a quarter problem, you know. We know that we have to do it, but we don't want to do it this quarter. Yeah? Sometimes people think that politicians are thinking only in 4 years period, but actually the management of public listed companies are thinking only in a quarter point of view. Yeah? So sooner or later we will face that issue, not because even if there is no policy, simply I don't believe that China will allow European companies to make more money in China than in Europe. Sooner or later, they will replace their products by their internal production. So I think that the market would react to the reality which we have with China. And the biggest problem which I see is a ability of China to scale up. China doesn't have such a big ability to be innovative, despite of all progress they did, but they have an ability to scale up, which we don't have in Europe.
Thank you, Petr. There is a question on Slido from Peter Heffeler. Is Peter here? No, it's Peter. Okay. We've been in touch on LinkedIn, so now it's nice to put name to face. Which raises the question, perhaps you could speak to this, Koray. What can we learn e.g. from Japan's economic security policy? Well, we can talk about Japan or other best. Is there best practice out there? Has anyone nailed this problem? I mean, out in East Asia, obviously, it's right in front of them, and they have closer trading relationships, usually, even than Europeans and Americans do. So is there a best practice we can all emulate?
I want to put the realist out of me here for a moment. It may be also different to some views, so I'll share a fact back. Chinese energy runs on coal for 60% of its entirety. polluting the entire environment. Solar panels in China are made by children. Unless we want to do that and we want to pollute the environment for our energy needs, then actually our price for the energy is by choice, not by circumstances. And if we do that choice because we want that investment, then the economic policy is that we become independent and better human beings and better to the planet and better to the children in the context of what we do and what we don't do. And that's why I said we need to figure out what values we compete on with China. If you say, oh, you know, the energy is so expensive in Europe, yeah, by choice. In the US, it's so expensive. No, it's by choice because US can be easily energy independent. You know, drill, baby, drill is not a dream. It can happen, and very quickly, and then the US is energy independent. So it's not necessarily about energy. And also, I don't necessarily agree that technology is your only advantage. Technology is the advantage if you can build it at scale. And what that means is we need to realize that China and all that narrative that is put out that, oh, they're going to invest billions and they're so focused on it, they cannot do the AI chips that we can do in the Western world. They do not have the brain power, and sorry, you know, I don't mean to offend, that the Western world has in the context of creativity and ingenuity. They have the ability to scale up, to put policy into place rather quickly and build things in a year that we cannot build in 10 years. But the circumstances of doing that come at a high cost that we do not want to bear as a society, not the way we want to live. So in that context, Japan's policy and economic policy has always relied on a manufacturing environment that is not necessarily innovative, but it's really good and doing things better that have already been innovated. And that in scale, and at places that actually do that cheap. So Japanese companies were the first to invest in China, their manufacturing sites. I was part of that. They were first to invest in Myanmar as first of that. They take those risks and go first. They were the first in Philippines and Thailand, right? What I miss in the EU, and Japan has done that in their economic security policy, is the European Belt and Road Initiative. Now I dropped it, right? So the EIB's investment, 90% of it goes inside member states. What does that tell us? We only have visibility to tier 1. Why? Because we don't figure out how to do lower tier. Well, that's why we created the AI technology that actually helps companies and governments to see further, because it's great that you have an idea. It's great that you create the IP, but if you cannot manufacture at scale in a diversified environment and you go to buy copper from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 2/3 of the time the Chinese will actually own that copper mine, right? And you need rare earth minerals, well, the Chinese will own that rare earth mineral refinery. So in that context, what we need to do is have companies equipped with visibility in multi-tier, with intelligence to say, where does it come from source to grave, and what actually does our values align with it or not? Child labor, toxic radioactive material. 1 ton of rare earth mineral creates 1 ton of toxic toxic waste land. And do we want that? And how we can contain that? We have the ideas, we have the innovation. Europe and its tech environment is great in innovating, horrible in scaling up. The venture capitalists realize that, so they love to invest in high scale-ups in the US. We are luckily a European-American company, so we see both sides of the story. But at the end of the day, the Japanese economic policy has had its Belt and Road Initiative. They have the problem of demographic change quite significantly. We don't do that. We don't have that problem yet. So at the end of the day, can we learn from that? Absolutely. And I would urge politicians, policymakers to think about investment chains that secure the European need for raw material. And when we have that, concatenate that with the technology and innovation that we have, and now we have a powerhouse that is equal and see eye to eye with the US.
Does anybody want to jump in from the audience? Yes, please, sir.
My name is Marcin Jerzewski. I'm the head of Taiwan office for the European Value Center for Security Policy. My question is related to the European Union's push for more corporate sustainability due diligence and how it may reshape the relationships with China. So Europe finally managed to pass CSDDD before the end of the term of the previous European Parliament, but something that is different in the European model of economic security from the Japanese model that we just discussed is that there isn't a very explicit link yet between the push for more due diligence and pursuing economic security. So is there potential to establish this link? Is there desire to establish this link? And if there isn't, then still, how will the push for more due diligence reshape our relations with China? Thank you.
Thank you. We have literally 3 minutes left, so perhaps anybody can answer that question and everybody make a final 30 seconds. And I want to come back to where we started, because it's always the same problem with Europe, is what is the danger of fragmentation down from the policy in Brussels? And it's particularly the case. Germany is in a very difficult economic situation. And, try telling German industry that they've got to, and of course we should do this, and they should listen, that they have to consider human rights, and they have to consider, ethical trade, and they will probably consider their own security. But it's a difficult sell. And, first of all, coming to the question, anybody who wants to field that, fine. But perhaps all of you, starting on this side, Mirek, since you started out, just literally 30 seconds, what is the danger of fragmentation at a very difficult economic time in terms of trade policy for the European Union?
Yeah, I think obviously, Abigaël, I think, touched upon it, that, the EU is a little different from the US. I have seen, and so I would just like to go back to the point that I made earlier about the transition, a little bit, for example, even on the partnerships for the global gateway, that yes, it is, so China had a head start on the belts and roads, it's been around for a while. But I do think when I talk to EIB people, EBRD people, etc., so there's a lot of work now being done to actually change that and build those relationships. I think we also, or Europe saw it with the Ukraine war then, that when they went to other places in the world, not everyone was actually seeing it the way they saw it or they see it. And so I think there is a great deal of work right now in those geographies, on trade, on securing supply chains, also around critical minerals, etc. I think the refining thing, you're right, is highly concentrated. But as you know, if you talk to someone like Mr. Hochstein in DC, etc., also from the US side, big wake-up call, and they're building these infrastructure value chains. So I think we will see. I think people realize that they need to work on those things and pay attention to the other, of course, geographies that are very important. It also links to the BRICS question here, because it's true, yeah, now suddenly we have a BRICS alliance that is much bigger. They're admitting all kinds of countries, and that's going to, of course, have effect also in economic and trade relationships. But just back to your question on the even like German companies in China, access to China. I was just there recently for that summit in June. So we had a lot of. It happened to be a lot of German executives that are based in China, heading those companies there. And obviously, I think the big shock, frankly, of the early months, I think, is gone. And now they're trying to figure out, okay, do I build plans only for China? What does China +1 mean for my company? And so I think we will see a lot of changes, and you could argue that actually the time that we had before COVID for some of these companies was actually more of an exceptional thing, and they're coming to a new normal.
Thank you. As you can see, time's up, but 10 seconds for each of you.
Just very quickly to you, we cannot play the game assuming everybody plays by the rules. So think about like a soccer field, right? And then there's the Chinese player, and he just kicks and hits and takes the ball with their hands, and they can't get a red card, so we need to realize that. However, in the CSDD environment, we make our own rules for ourselves, how we want to decide our economy to work. And that only works when you set audacious goals and legislation and industry follows. It has very seldomly been different. In AI, it's also like we go too far and then we're going to come back. But at the end of the day, the CSDD environment, that the modern slavery, that scope 3 is important for us and for the planet, is something that will impede China to just play by its own rules and still get the benefits out of the trade relationship that for decades has been negative. And the only country that is slightly a little bit positive is Germany for some time. But other than that, the EU does not have much benefit than other consumer goods to be kept low in an inflationary environment. So very quickly, my last point is like the EU should be more confident, totally agree with the global gateway policy to be accelerated, but those regulations and rules require technology, especially for SMEs, to just comply with, because the Germans are so afraid of paperwork, and I'm German, we love faxing things, so fax, right, fax machines. The Americans don't even know what that is anymore. So once we have digitization become the core of our society, I think even SMEs can comply with the rules that we set as our society to be a better society.
Very good, thank you. Petr, very quickly, and Abigaël, very
sure.
quickly.
My recommendation for Europe is to be more focused on homeworks. Create a real single market, to mobilize a private capital through capital markets, and that's the environment which can help us to fulfill all our goals which we have. And then that's the way how we can really protect our market sustainably, including the environmental aspects.
Thank you. Abigaël, you have the last word, a quick one, please.
Yes. And I think it's going to be about Global South, or whatever you decide to call it today. And it's to say fragmentation and the competitions we discussed today is going to have an impact for Europe also in third markets. And the capacity of our companies to continue being competitive in third market, I think this is the challenge to tomorrow. This is also linked to due diligence and the whole normative package that Europe can pull up, and how do you have this environment and still be competitive in third market. And it does mean reflecting about a more comprehensive and strategic offer, that where Global Gateway is part of it, but we also consider the digital partnerships, the green aspects of it. This would include, for instance, the critical raw materials partnership that European Union are signing at the moment. So be more comprehensive and strategic with the third countries.
Thank you very much. Everybody stay in your seats, because the next session, which is a related session, there'll be a seamless web. But just before we go to the next session, please thank our panelists for an excellent discussion.